Propaganda. The formation of men's attitudes. Jacques Ellul, author of the Technological Society. Introduction. Jacques Ellul's view of propaganda and his approach to the study of propaganda are new. The principal difference between his thought edifice and most other literature on propaganda is that Ellul regards propaganda as a sociological phenomenon rather than as something made by certain people for certain purposes. Propaganda exists and thrives, it is the Siamese twin of our technological society. Only in the technological society can there be anything of the type and order of magnitude of modern propaganda, which is with us forever, and only with the all-pervading effects that flow from propaganda can the technological society hold itself together and further expand. Most people are easy prey for propaganda, Ellul says, because of their firm but entirely erroneous conviction that it is composed only of lies and tall stories and that, conversely, what is true cannot be propaganda. But modern propaganda has long disdained the ridiculous lies of past and outmoded forms of propaganda. It operates instead with many different lands of truth, half-truth, limited truth, truth out of context. Even Goebbels always insisted that Wehrmacht communiques be as accurate as possible. A second basic misconception that makes people vulnerable to propaganda is the notion that it serves only to change opinions. Why? That is one of its aims, but a limited, subordinate one. Much more importantly, it aims to intensify existing trends, to sharpen and focus them, and, above all, to lead men to action, or, when it is directed at immovable opponents, to non-action through terror or discouragement, to prevent them from interfering. Therefore Ellul distinguishes various forms of propaganda and calls his book Propagandes. That plural is one of the keys to his concept. The most trenchant distinction made by Ellul is between agitation propaganda and integration propaganda. The former leads men from mere resentment to rebellion, the latter aims at making them adjust themselves to desired patterns. The two types rely on entirely different means. Both exist all over the world. Integration propaganda is needed especially for the technological society to flourish, and its technological means, mass media among them in turn make such integration propaganda possible. A related point, central in Ellul's thesis, is that modern propaganda cannot work without education. He thus reverses the widespread notion that education is the best prophylactic against propaganda. On the contrary, he says, education, or what usually goes by that word in the modern world, is the absolute prerequisite for propaganda. In fact, education is largely identical with what Ellul calls pre-propaganda, the conditioning of minds with vast amounts of incoherent information, already dispensed for ulterior purposes and posing as facts and as education. Ellul follows through by designating intellectuals as virtually the most vulnerable of all to modern propaganda, for three reasons: X, they absorb the largest amount of second-hand, unverifiable information; 2, they feel a compelling need to have an opinion on every important question of our time, and thus easily succumb to opinions offered to them by propaganda on all such indigestible pieces of information; 3, they consider themselves capable of judging for themselves. They literally need propaganda. In fact, the need for propaganda on the part of the propagandee is one of the most powerful elements of Ellul's thesis. Cast out of the disintegrating microgroups of the past, such as family, church, or village, the individual is plunged into mass society and thrown back upon his own inadequate resources, his isolation, his loneliness, his ineffectuality. Propaganda then hands him in veritable abundance what he needs: a raison d'être, personal involvement and participation in important events, an outlet. Introduction. 7. And excuse for some of his more doubtful impulses: righteousness, all factitious, to be sure, all more or less spurious, but he drinks it all in and asks for more. Without this intense collaboration by the propagandee, the propagandist would be helpless. Thus propaganda, by first creating pseudo-needs through pre-propaganda and then providing pseudo-satisfactions for them, is pernicious. Can wholesome propaganda be made for a wholesome cause? Can democracy, Christianity, humanism be propagated by modern propaganda techniques? Ellul traces the similarities among all propaganda efforts: communist, Nazi, democratic. He thinks that no one can use this intrinsically undemocratic weapon, or, rather, abandon himself to it, unscathed or without undergoing deep transformations in the process. He shows the inevitable, unwilled propaganda effects of which the good propagandist is unaware, the fallout from any major propaganda activity and all its pernicious consequences. Most pernicious of all, the process, once fully launched, tends to become irreversible. Ellul critically reviews what most American authors have written on the subject of propaganda and mass media, having studied the literature from Laswell to Reisman with great thoroughness. Accepting some of their findings, he rejects others, particularly the efforts to gauge the effects of propaganda. Ellul believes that, on the whole, propaganda is much more effective, and effective in many more ways, than most American analysis shows. Particularly, he rejects as unrealistic and meaningless all experiments that have been conducted with small groups. Propaganda is a unique phenomenon that results from the totality of forces pressing in upon an individual in his society, and therefore cannot be duplicated in a test tube. To make his many original points, Ellul never relies on statistics or quantification, which he heartily disdains, but on observation and logic. His treatise is a fully integrated structure of thought in which every piece fits in with all the others, be they 100 pages apart. In this respect his work resembles Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Idea, of which the philosopher said that the reader, really to understand the book, must read it twice because no page in the book could be fully understood without knowledge of the whole. This procedure can hardly be suggested to the reader in our busy days. But he ought to be warned that to leaf through this book will not suffice. Paul Pickrell, in Harper's Magazine, said of Ellul's The Technological Society that Ellul, a great man, had written with monumental calm and maddening thoroughness. A magnificent book. Ellul's propaganda is no less maddening, monumental, and thorough. What, in Ellul's view, can mankind do? At the end of this book, Ellul reaches neither a pessimistic nor an optimistic conclusion with regard to the future. He merely states that, in his view, propaganda is today a greater danger to mankind than any of the other more grandly advertised threats hanging over the human race. His super-analysis ends with a warning, not a prophecy. February 1965. Comrade Kellin. Preface. Propaganda, by whatever name we may call it, has become a very general phenomenon in the modern world. Differences in political regimes matter little, differences in social levels are more important, and most important is national self-awareness. In the world today there are three great propaganda blocs: the USSR, China, and the United States. These are the most important propaganda systems in terms of scope, depth, and coherence. Incidentally, they represent three entirely different types and methods of propaganda. Next are the propaganda systems, in various stages of development and effectiveness, but less advanced than in the three, of a whole group of countries. These are the socialist republics of Europe and Asia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, East Germany, North Vietnam. They model their propaganda on that of the USSR, albeit with some gaps, some lack of understanding and without adequate resources. Then there are West Germany, France, Spain, Egypt, South Vietnam, and Korea, with less elaborate and rather diffuse forms of propaganda. Countries such as Italy and Argentina, which once had powerful propaganda systems, no longer use this weapon. Whatever the diversity of countries and methods, they have one characteristic in common: concern with effectiveness. One propaganda is made, first of all, because of a will to action, for the purpose of effectively arming policy and giving irresistible power to its decisions. 2. Whoever handles this instrument can be concerned solely with effectiveness. This is the supreme law, which must never be forgotten when the phenomenon of propaganda is analyzed. Ineffective propaganda is no propaganda. This instrument belongs to the technological universe, shares its characteristics, and is indissolubly linked to it. Not only is propaganda itself a technique, it is also an indispensable condition for the development of technical progress and the establishment of a technological civilization. And, as with all techniques, propaganda is subject to the law of efficiency. But whereas it is relatively easy to study a precise technique, whose scope can be defined, a study of propaganda runs into some extraordinary obstacles. From the outset it is obvious that there is great uncertainty about the phenomenon itself, arising first of all from a priori moral or political concepts. Propaganda is usually regarded as an evil. This in itself makes a study difficult. To study anything properly, one must put aside ethical judgments. Perhaps an objective study will lead us back to them, but only later, and with full cognizance of the facts. A second source of confusion is the general conviction, derived from past experience, that propaganda consists mainly of tad stories, disseminated by means of lies. To adopt this view is to prevent oneself from understanding anything about the actoal phenomenon, which is very different from what it was in the past. Even when these obstacles have been removed, it is still very difficult to determine what constitutes propaganda in our world and what the nature of propaganda is. This is because it is a secret action. The temptation is then twofold, to agree with Jacques. 1. Goebbels said, "We do not talk to say something, but to obtain a certain effect." And F.G. Bartlett accurately states that the goal of propaganda is not to increase political understanding of events, but to obtain results through action. Harold D. Laswell's definition of the goal of propaganda is accurate: to maximize the power at home by subordinating groups and individuals, while reducing the material cost of power. Similarly, in war, propaganda is an attempt to win victory with a minimum of physical expense. Before the war, propaganda is a substitute for physical violence. During the war, it is a supplement to it. Preface 11. Driancourt that everything is propaganda because everything in the political or economic spheres seems to be penetrated and molded by this force, or, as certain modern American social scientists have done, to abandon the term propaganda altogether because it cannot be defined with any degree of precision. Either course is inadmissible intellectual surrender. To adopt either attitude would lead us to abandon the study of a phenomenon that exists and needs to be defined. We then came up against the extreme difficulty of definition. We can immediately discard such simplistic definitions as Marbury B. Ogle's, propaganda is any effort to change opinions or attitudes. The propagandist is anyone who communicates his ideas with the intent of influencing his listener. Such a definition would include the teacher, the priest, indeed any person conversing with another on any topic. Such a broad definition clearly does not help us to understand the specific character of propaganda. As far as definitions are concerned, there has been a characteristic evolution in the United States. From 1920 to about 1933 the main emphasis was on the psychological. Propaganda is a manipulation of psychological symbols having goals of which the listener is not conscious. Since the appearance of Laswell's studies, propaganda by other means and with stated objectives has been considered possible. Attention then became focused on the intention of the propagandist. In more recent books, the aim to indoctrinate, particularly in regard to political, economic, and social matters, has been regarded as the hallmark of propaganda. Within this frame of reference one could determine what constitutes propaganda by looking at the propagandist. Such and such a person is a propagandist, therefore his words and deeds are propaganda. But it appears that American authors eventually accepted the definition given by the Institute for Propaganda Analysis and inspired by Laswell. Propaganda is the expression of opinions or actions carried out deliberately by individuals or groups with a view to influencing. John L. Bigg has named these elements of definition: the secret character of the sources and goals of propaganda, the intention to modify opinions, the dissemination of conclusions of doubtful validity, the notion of inculcating ideas rather than explaining them. This is partially correct, but outdated. 12. The opinions or actions of other individuals or groups for predetermined ends and through psychological manipulations. 4. We could quote definitions for pages on end. An Italian author, Antonio Maiato, says that propaganda is a technique of social pressure which tends to create psychological or social groups with a unified structure across the homogeneity of the affective and mental states of the individuals under consideration. For Leonard W. Dube, the well-known American specialist, It is an attempt to modify personalities and control the behavior of individuals in relation to goals considered non-scientific or of doubtful value in a specific society and time period. And we would find even more remote definitions, if we examined the German or Russian literature on the subject. I will not give a definition of my own here. I only wanted to show the uncertainty among specialists on the question. I consider it more useful to proceed with the analysis of the characteristics of propaganda as an existing sociological phenomenon. It is perhaps proper to underline this term. We shall examine propaganda in both its past and present forms, for obviously we cannot eliminate from our study the highly developed propaganda systems of Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Russia, and Fascist Italy. This seems obvious, but is not. Many writers do not agree with this approach. They establish a certain image or definition of propaganda, and proceed to the study of whatever corresponds to their definition, or, yielding to the attraction of a scientific study, they try to experiment with some particular method of propaganda on small groups and in small doses, at which moment it ceases to be propaganda. To study propaganda we must turn not to the psychologist, but to the propagandist. We must examine not a test group, but a whole nation subjected to real and effective propaganda. Of course this excludes all so-called scientific, that is, statistical, types of study, but at least we shall have respected the object of our study, unlike many present-day specialists who establish a rigorous method of observation, but, in order to apply it, lose there. The idea is often added that propaganda deals with controversial questions in a group. More profound is Daniel Lemmer's idea that propaganda is a means of altering power ratios in a group by modifying attitudes through manipulation of symbols. However, I am not entirely in agreement with the exclusively psychological character of this definition. Preface 13. Object to be studied. Rather, we shall consider what the nature of propaganda is wherever it is applied and wherever it is dominated by a concern for effectiveness. Finally, we take the term propaganda in its broadest sense, so that it embraces the following areas. Psychological action. The propagandist seeks to modify opinions by purely psychological means. Most often he pursues a semi-educative objective and addresses himself to his fellow citizens. Psychological warfare. Here the propagandist is dealing with a foreign adversary whose morale he seeks to destroy by psychological means so that the opponent begins to doubt the validity of his beliefs and actions. 0. Re-education and brainwashing, complex methods of transforming an adversary into an ally which can be used only on prisoners. Public and human relations. These must necessarily be included in propaganda. This statement may shock some readers, but we shall show that these activities are propaganda because they seek to adapt the individual to a society, to a living standard, to an activity. They serve to make him conform, which is the aim of all propaganda. Propaganda in its broad sense includes all of these. In the narrow sense it is characterized by an institutional quality. In propaganda we find techniques of psychological influence combined with techniques of organization and the envelopment of people with the intention of sparking action. This, then, will be the broad field of our inquiry. From this complete universe of propaganda I have deliberately excluded the following subjects found in most propaganda studies. Historical accounts of propaganda, particularly of the recent past, propaganda in before or 1940, and so forth. Propaganda and public opinion as an entity, considering public opinion, its formation, and so forth, as the major problem, and propaganda as a simple instrument for forming or changing opinion as the minor problem. Psychological foundations of propaganda, on what prejudices, drives, motivations, passions, complexes, does the propagandist play? What psychic force does he utilize to obtain his results? The techniques of propaganda. How does the propagandist? 5. Morris M6 Gretz analysis distinguishes three parts: a propaganda agency, support of military operations, a politico-military action, to ensure submission of the population by technical, non-violent means, a coherent thought system. 14. Put the psychic force into action. How can he reach people? How can he induce them to act? The media of propaganda, the mass media of communication. Such are the 5 chapter headings found everywhere. Somewhat less common are studies on the characteristics of the great examples of propaganda, Hitlerite, Stalinist, American, and so on. These are omitted here precisely because they have been frequently analyzed. The reader will find in the bibliography all that is useful to know on each of these questions. I have instead tried to examine aspects of propaganda very rarely treated, to adopt a point of view, a perspective, an unorthodox view. I have sought to use a method that is neither abstract nor statistical, but occasionally relies on existing studies. The reader should know that he is not dealing with an encyclopedia of propaganda, but with a work that assumes his familiarity with its psychological foundations, techniques, and methods, and that endeavors to bring contemporary man a step closer to an awareness of propaganda, the very phenomenon that conditions and regulates him. On the other hand, I have considered propaganda as a whole. It is usual to pass ethical judgments on its ends, judgments that then redound on propaganda considered as a means, such as, because democracy is good and dictatorship bad, propaganda serving a democracy is good even if as a technique it is identical with propaganda serving a dictatorship. Or, because socialism is good and fascism bad, propaganda is not altogether evil in the hands of socialists, but is totally evil in fascist hands. Registered. I repudiate this attitude. Propaganda as a phenomenon is essentially the same in China or the Soviet Union or the United States or Algeria. Techniques tend to align themselves with one another. The media of dissemination may be more or less perfected, more or less directly used, just as organizations may be more or less effective, but that does not change the heart of the problem. Those who accept the principle of propaganda and decide to utilize it will inevitably employ the most effective organization and the methods. 7. Moreover, the premise of this book is that propaganda, no matter who makes it, be he the most upright and best intentioned of. 6. This is what Serge Chakhatin claims. 7. As Gret has said, the officers in Indochina who came in contact with North Vietnamese propaganda had an overall political view that substituted itself for the fragmented use of the technical means of propaganda. All this is part of the progression from old ideas to new phenomena. Preface. 15. Men, has certain identical results in communism or Hitlerism or Western democracy, inevitable results on the individual or groups, and different from the doctrine promulgated, or the regime supported, by that propaganda. In other words, Hitlerism as a regime had certain effects, and the propaganda used by the Nazis undeniably had certain specific characteristics. But whereas most analysts stop at this specificity, I have tried to eliminate it in order to look only at the most general characteristics, the effects common to all cases, to all methods of propaganda. Therefore I have adopted the same perspective and the same method in studying propaganda as in studying any other technique. I shall devote much space to the fact that propaganda has become an inescapable necessity for everyone. In this connection I have come upon a source of much misunderstanding. Modern man worships facts, that is, he accepts facts as the ultimate reality. He is convinced that what is good. He believes that facts in themselves provide evidence and proof, and he willingly subordinates values to them. He obeys what he believes to be necessity, which he somehow connects with the idea of progress. This stereotyped ideological attitude inevitably results in a confusion between judgments of probability and judgments of value. Because fact is the sole criterion, it must be good. Consequently it is assumed that anyone who states a fact, even without passing judgment on it, is, therefore, in favor of it. Anyone who asserts, simply stating a judgment of probability, that the communists will win some elections is immediately considered pro-communist. Anyone who says that all human activity is increasingly dominated by technology is viewed as a technocrat, and so on. As we proceed to analyze the development of propaganda, to consider its inescapable influence in the modern world and its connection with all structures of our society, the reader will be tempted to see an approval of propaganda. Because propaganda is presented as a necessity, such a work would therefore force the author to make propaganda, to foster it, to intensify it. I want to emphasize that nothing is further from my mind. Such an assumption is possible only by those who worship facts and power. In my opinion, necessity never establishes legitimacy. The world of necessity is a world of weakness, a world that denies man. To say that a phenomenon is necessary means, for me, that it denies man. Its necessity is proof of its power, not proof of its excellence. 16. However, confronted by a necessity, man must become aware of it, if he is to master it. As long as man denies the inevitability of a phenomenon, as long as he avoids facing up to it, he will go astray. He will delude himself, by submitting in fact to necessity while pretending that he is free in spite of it, and simply because he claims to be free. Only when he realizes his delusion will he experience the beginning of genuine freedom, in the act of realization itself, be it only from the effort to stand back and look squarely at the phenomenon and reduce it to raw fact. The force of propaganda is a direct attack against man. The question is to determine how great is the danger. Most replies are based on unconscious a priori dogmas. Thus the communists, who do not believe in human nature but only in the human condition, believe that propaganda is all-powerful, legitimate, whenever they employ it, and instrumental in creating a new type of man. American sociologists scientifically try to play down the effectiveness of propaganda because they cannot accept the idea that the individual, that cornerstone of democracy, can be so fragile, and because they retain their ultimate trust in man. Personally, I, too, tend to believe in the preeminence of man and, consequently, in his invincibility. Nevertheless, as I observe the facts, I realize man is terribly malleable, uncertain of himself, ready to accept and to follow many suggestions, and is tossed about by all winds of doctrine. But when, in the course of these pages, I shall reveal the full power of propaganda against man, when I advance to the very threshold of showing the most profound changes in his personality, it does not mean I am anti-democratic. The strength of propaganda reveals, of course, one of the most dangerous flaws of democracy. But that has nothing to do with my own opinions. If I am in favor of democracy, I can only regret that propaganda renders the true exercise of it almost impossible. But I think it would be even worse to entertain any illusions about a coexistence of true democracy and propaganda. Nothing is worse in times of danger than to live in a dream world. To warn a political system of the menace hanging over it does not imply an attack against it, but is the greatest service one can render the system. The same goes for man. To warn him of his weakness is not to attempt to destroy him, but rather to encourage him to strengthen himself. I have no sympathy with. Preface, 17. The haughty aristocratic intellectual who judges from on high, believing himself invulnerable to the destructive forces of his time, and disdainfully considers the common people as cattle to be manipulated, to be molded by the action of propaganda in the most intimate aspects of their being. I insist that to give such warning is an act in the defense of man, that I am not judging propaganda with Olympian detachment, and that having suffered, felt, and analyzed the impact of the power of propaganda on myself, having been time and again, and still being, the object of propaganda, I want to speak of it as a menace which threatens the total personality. In order to delineate the real dimensions of propaganda we must always consider it within the context of civilization. Perhaps the most fundamental defect of most studies made on the subject is their attempt to analyze propaganda as an isolated phenomenon. This corresponds to the rather prevalent attitude that separates socio-political phenomena from each other and of not establishing any correlation between parts, an attitude that in turn reassures the student of the validity of the various systems. Democracy, for example, is studied as if the citizen were an entity separate from the state, as if public opinion were a thing in itself. Meanwhile, the scientific study of public opinion and propaganda is left to other specialists, and the specialist in public opinion in turn relies on the jurist to define a suitable legal framework for democracy. The problems of the technological society are studied without reference to their possible influence on mental and emotional life. The labor movement is examined without attention to the changes brought about by psychological means, and so on. Again, I want to emphasize that the study of propaganda must be conducted within the context of the technological society. Propaganda is called upon to solve problems created by technology, to play on maladjustments, and to integrate the individual into a technological world. Propaganda is a good deal less the political weapon of a regime, it is that also, than the effect of a technological society that embraces the entire man and tends to be a completely integrated society. At the present time, propaganda is the innermost, and most elusive, manifestation of this trend. Propaganda must be seen as situated at the center of the growing powers of the state and governmental and ad. 18. Administrative techniques. People keep saying, everything depends on what kind of a state makes use of propaganda. But if we really have understood the technological state, such a statement becomes meaningless. In the midst of increasing mechanization and technological organization, propaganda is simply the means used to prevent these things from being felt as too oppressive and to persuade man to submit with good grace. When man will be fully adapted to this technological society, when he will end by obeying with enthusiasm, convinced of the excellence of what he is forced to do, the constraint of the organization will no longer be felt by him. The truth is, it will no longer be a constraint, and the police will have nothing to do. The civic and technological goodwill and the enthusiasm for the right social myths, both created by propaganda, will finally have solved the problem of man.